Welcome back to Face the Nation. We return to our conversation with Utah Republican Senator John Curtis. Good to see you here in person,
It's
Senator.
nice to be in person. Good morning. And lots to talk about today.
Absolutely. I want to get your perspective on the decision by the president on Friday to dismiss not only the chair of the Joint Chiefs, but also 5 other senior military officers. The former chair of the Joint Chiefs, General Martin Dempsey, released a statement saying, "Trust should be based on leadership, integrity, and performance. To relieve a senior officer, not for a lack of one of those qualities, but for a real or perceived disagreement in their beliefs, harmfully politicizes the military profession." Are you concerned that's what's happening here?
You know, I think we have to stop and look what happened really last November. And one of my colleagues described it this way. It was a stop the car moment. Those of us who have had young kids and have been on family vacations know what a stop the car moment is. It's kids, you're so disruptive, we're stopping the car. And I think in many ways, the American people said, stop the car. We want dramatic change. We're unhappy with what's happening at the border. We're unhappy with the economy. We're unhappy with so many things. You keep promising that you're going to cut spending and you don't. Stop the car. And so people really shouldn't be surprised that this is a stop the car moment. We don't get to go to Disneyland until we figure this out. And I think that's what people are seeing right now in Washington.
But you think part of the public frustration or that there was correct to be frustration with the leadership at the Pentagon or the president's top military advisor?
Look, we elected a commander-in-chief last November. This is his discretion. They want change. The people want change. We all knew what we were getting with President Trump, right? Nobody should be really surprised at these dramatic shocks to the system. The system needs a shock. And I think what you're seeing as a result of that.
There is concern, though, at a time of geopolitical risk, as our Pentagon correspondent was suggesting there, that carrying the institutional knowledge with you through a transition, we're still at the beginning of the Trump administration, certainly, that there could be a hiccup there or some complication. Lieutenant General Kane is a 3-star. He's retired. It's not clear if he needs a congressional waiver or not to take this job because he didn't run a combatant command. Do you know how complicated it will be to get him in place, or how long?
Yeah, I don't, and I'm not overly worried about that.
Okay.
I'll come back to this. American people have asked for change. They've lost confidence in so many things. They want to see dramatic change. That was a stop the car moment, and what happened at the Pentagon was a stop the car moment. Let's make some change. We've tried subtle changes. We've tried the easy changes. We've tried working around the edges. And I think the American people are saying, it didn't work. Let's do something more dramatic.
Well, we've certainly seen dramatic. You had the video at the Conservative Political Action Committee of Elon Musk wielding this shiny chainsaw. It's celebrating this Department of Government efficiency idea. Yesterday, federal employees also received an email, I'm sure you've heard, telling them to reply by midnight Monday to a message with 5 bullet points of what they accomplished in the last week. Elon Musk tweeted, failure to do so would result in firing. Utah has 33,000 federal employees. Is that how they should be treated?
So listen, let's go back to $36,000 trillion of debt, and we have to do something dramatic. Now, to answer your question, I don't believe so. You know, I just published an op-ed, deseret.com, and I talk about my experience as mayor and having to do similar things. If I could say one thing to Elon Musk, it's like, please put a dose of compassion in this. These are real people. These are real lives. These are mortgages. It's a false narrative to say we have to cut and you have to be cruel to do it as well. We can do both.
Well, it's not just about efficiency, though. I mean, the president himself has characterized this as getting rid of bad people.
I regret that narrative. We all know, thousands, millions of federal workers who are good people, who work hard. But the reality of it is we have 3 million federal workers. Not all of them do. Many aren't coming to work. In my business...
Working from home, you mean?
Working from home. Let's hope they're working from home. We don't know. That's why the email. What are you doing? It's not unusual in a corporate setting to have people report and explain what they're doing, especially if they're working from home. So I don't think this is a request that is that difficult. I would ask my employees to let me know what they're doing. But I will double down on the fact of we don't need to be so cold and hard. and let's put a little compassion and, quite frankly, dignity in this as well.
Right. And in that op-ed, you said sometimes it is the worst day of someone's life.
It is.
To receive a notice like this.
Yeah, going back to my experience as mayor, we did have to let some people go. We did a lot through attrition, but every single person we let go, I met with personally. I looked them in the eye. I told them why we had to do it. How can we then help you transition to the next thing? We can do both things.
Well, that's not happening at all right now, as you know. And at these department agencies, I mean, some of them, they're just getting locked out of systems. People don't even know who to ask. They can't ask HR, and HR says, I don't know, if they can't get hold of them at all.
But also, I'll also come back to this stop the car moment. Like, this is not a normal moment. We have tried. We've tried for years to do this gracefully. We've tried for years to do this slowly, and we have failed consistently. And the American people said, enough. We're tired of this. You have to make these changes.
So do you believe the president has the unilateral authority to cancel funds appropriated by Congress?
Well, what we're seeing play out is this wrestle between the three branches of government.
Yep.
We'll find out. And this is the beauty of the system.
You don't have a point of view?
Well, listen, I believe in the Constitution, right? I believe this is how we test the Constitution. And people have said, oh, this is a constitutional crisis. And I say exactly the opposite. It's proving to work. We have the courts playing it. We have Congress who will play in. We have the ability. I think we hold a lot of responsibility for what's happening right now. We could solve the budget as Congress. We could solve the border, and we haven't. And both parties, when Congress doesn't do their job in the White House, have a tendency to try to solve it. Let's let this play out by the Constitution, and then Congress, let's step up, right? We need to do it. I'll be the first to say, this is a problem the Congress, in many cases, has given the American people.
The pushback has been relatively quiet. You're gently doing that by saying, be more compassionate. Senator Murkowski was telling constituents the other day, I can't be the only one speaking out.
So listen,
are Republican lawmakers going to be more forceful?
Well, listen, I don't know what you want me to be more forceful on. Stop the car. Like, fix this. That's what Utahns are telling me.
In terms of the congressional role here, the check that
but
Congress
I also
is
think that's a
supposed to put on
stop the car
executive.
moment. Congress has failed in these things, and the people have said, fix it. So Donald Trump is trying to fix it with the tools that he has. The courts will push back if he steps out of line. We've seen that. We know that. We saw that with President Biden as well. And that's the beauty of the system. It works. Now, it's very, the people back home are impatient. If you were to walk on the streets in Utah, they would say, stop the car, John. Like, this is not good. You have promised, your colleagues have promised for decades that you would fix these things, and you haven't.
Well, we'll see if the fiscal problems are fixed in the near term, Senator. It's going to be up to you and your fellow lawmakers. We'll be right back. We're joined now by Maryland Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen. Good to have you here. I want to refer back to the interview we just did with the president's special envoy, Steve Witkoff. You watch the Middle East closely. I know you were just meeting with Arab leaders when you were in Europe last week. He said that it is not realistic to have Palestinians remain in Gaza while it is rebuilt. Egypt and Jordan are working on plans for that to be possible. Does that proposal have any chance of surviving, or is this idea of moving them away for 15 years going to happen?
So the good news in what Steve Witkoff said was that he expected us to get to phase 2 of the discussions. The very bad news was he did not disavow this outrageous idea that Donald Trump put on the table of cleaning out 2 million Gazans. That is ethnic cleansing by another name. And Arab countries are right now working very hard to put together a plan to show that you can deal with governance, security, and reconstruction, and that you don't need to have 2 million people pushed out of Gaza in order to do it. It is tough. It will have to be done in stages. And they have identified areas in Gaza, few areas in Gaza that have not been obliterated, where you could begin to phase the reconstruction and at least get people housing, temporary housing, as you rebuild in other areas.
But how does that survive if the United States, the most powerful player, is saying that's not what we want to do?
Well, this is a big problem
Yeah.
because when Trump made those statements, what he did was fueled even more the far, far right in Israel, the Ben-Gvirs, the Smotriches, who were just celebrating because their idea all along has been to move 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza. They also want to move Palestinians out of the West Bank into places like Jordan and Egypt. So in addition to being a reprehensible idea for moral and legal reasons, it would also totally destabilize the region, which is why the Arab countries are working so furiously to put together a plan that addresses these issues and has a future horizon that provides security to both Israelis and Palestinians and self-determination for both Israelis and Palestinians.
We are also hearing that the president is closing in on this deal with Ukraine in regard to its mineral resources that can be used for all sorts of valuable technology. What security guarantees are you comfortable with the U.S. giving to Ukraine as part of any of this?
Well, I think this is all negotiable. But what you should not do, Margaret, is begin your negotiation with Putin by, number one, adopting the Putin narrative, saying that Ukraine started this war, which is just a big lie. And you shouldn't begin by giving up certain key cards. So, for example, American guarantees or a future for Ukraine in NATO. However you settle this in the end is a matter of negotiation, but it's terrible negotiating to give up those cards right up front, as Trump has done.
It was extraordinary to hear Steve Witkoff describe his meeting with Vladimir Putin as he did for us.
I would just say that this is not America first. This is America in retreat. And China and Russia and our adversaries are celebrating every moment of this as our allies are scared to death. And this is not just rhetoric. This is reality.
This is what you heard at Munich last week?
Yeah, well, and I think, European allies and others from around the world who believe in freedom and democracy, they're wondering whether this is just rhetoric or whether this is a real shift. My warning to them is I think this is reality. I think Trump is much closer ideologically to Putin and other autocrats around the world than he is to democratic countries.
An extraordinary statement to digest, but I want to ask you about what's happening here at home because you sit in some powerful committees. The administration did have some legal wins this past week. USAID, a federal judge, said that they can put on administrative leave thousands of USAID employees. Another district court denied a request from unions to stop the firing of federal employees. Are Democrats too knee-jerk to say that all this is unlawful?
No, this is unlawful. In many of these cases, judges found that the plaintiffs did not have standing, but other parts of their opinion clearly indicated that Elon Musk did not have the authority to do what he's doing. So we just talked about the great betrayal of the Ukrainian people. What we're witnessing now is the great betrayal of the American people. Canada, Trump said he was going to lower prices. Right now, what he's doing is slashing important public services that help every American in order to finance a tax cut for the super rich, for Elon Musk and the billionaires.
So there was this email that went out yesterday to federal employees. We know that at the FBI and the State Department, management inside those agencies have told employees, don't respond to the personnel email saying, respond with your 5 bullet points. Can people working at the State Department feel safe not responding? Are they putting their jobs at risk?
I don't think so, because what we are witnessing are illegal actions by Elon Musk. And a number of courts, as you know, have issued temporary restraining orders on their efforts to seize important private information, but also on their overall conduct. So what the head of management of the State Department said is Elon Musk doesn't have the authority to require State Department employees to answer these questions. That has to happen in the chain of command.
Even though the president says he wants them to be more aggressive.
So the reality is we don't know what the president meant, but as you pointed out, you've got Elon Musk taking a chainsaw to the federal government and important services. And there's no Article 4 in the Constitution that gives Elon Musk that authority. And the way that he's been sort of, quote, delegated this authority is illegal, and the actions he's taking are illegal, and we need to shut down this illegal operation.
Senator Van Hollen, thank you for your insight today.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. We turn now to Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's a former FDA commissioner and current Pfizer board member. Welcome back, Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks a lot.
We've seen these troubling measles outbreaks in Texas and New Mexico, nearly 100 people sickened. It looks like most of those who have been infected were unvaccinated, and the outbreak area has one of the highest vaccination exemption rates in the state. How concerned are you, though, that this could spread?
Very concerned. I think this will spread. There's been 100 cases that have been identified so far. There's probably many more than that. So I think that this is going to get into the hundreds of cases and could take many months to try to fully snuff out. And when you have that kind of a concentration of measles within a community, it's going to inevitably spread outside that community. When you look around the country, there's a lot of parts of the country, states that have relatively low vaccination rates when it comes to MMR right now. You look at Idaho, about 80% of children have been vaccinated for MMR. Alaska and Wisconsin are about at 84%, Minnesota 87%, states like Florida, Colorado, Oklahoma, Georgia, Utah are around 88%. Iowa, I think, is at 89%, and herd immunity is achieved at a vaccination rate of between 93 and 95%. And even within those states, it's not like the low vaccination rates are distributed evenly across the states. There's pockets of under-vaccination. There's communities that have relatively low vaccination rates. And so when you have this much virus spreading in that portion of Texas and New Mexico, I think that there's some inevitability that you're going to see cases exported into those other states where there's low vaccination rates, and you could see a continuous spread across the country. Even at a low level, we could get some endemic spread. And the risk to the United States right now is that a virus that has been largely extinguished from circulation in the U.S. could return and just continue to spread even at a low level. And the U.S. could be at risk of losing its measles elimination status, which would have more profound implications on things like travel advisories that could be initiated from other countries. And so beyond just the public health impact of this, which I think is quite substantial, there could be some economic impacts as well. And finally, when you look at that outbreak in Texas, 27% of people have been hospitalized, and there's been 4 cases where children have contracted measles that have been vaccinated. So those were probably kids who only had 1 dose of the vaccine. But there's a lot of people who are at risk of this beyond just the people who have chosen to forego the vaccine.
That's terrifying, doctor. And kids are usually vaccinated, as any parent knows, around 1 year old, roughly. The MMR vaccine, though this is the vaccine against measles, is particularly scrutinized. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is now the HHS secretary, has accused of causing issues in children. He wrote the foreword to a book questioning vaccines, saying measles is a disease that is rarely life-threatening and a vaccine that is largely unnecessary but carries real risks. He is now the HHS secretary. How does he restore confidence in a vaccine that he previously denigrated?
Well, look, I think it's going to be difficult, and as best I can tell, he hasn't spoken to this outbreak. I think you captured the essence of the argument from Mr. Kennedy, as well as people within his anti-vax movement, that they believe this vaccine isn't effective. That's not true. It's highly effective, and that measles itself isn't a bad illness. And I think there's been some statements that actually getting measles has certain long-term advantages, which is just patently false. This is a very dangerous virus. And as I said, about 27% of the kids who've been infected in that West Texas outbreak and the New Mexico outbreak have been hospitalized. So this could be a quite serious illness with long-term consequences. Herd immunity is achieved at 93 to 95%. We're well below that in most parts of the country. Texas actually has a high vaccination rate, and I think Texas local public health officials are doing a good job to try to get control of this outbreak. But now that it's stretched into the hundreds of cases, it's going to be very difficult. This has been a vaccine that's been studied extensively. The alleged links between MMR vaccine and autism have been the subject of some of the largest studies ever undertaken. There were 2 studies done in Denmark, each with about 500,000 children enrolled in those studies. There were also a number of studies that were commissioned by the CDC and the NIH also looking at this in the United States. And so this is one of the most extensively studied questions, the purported link between MMR and autism. And I think the reality is sometimes we have to accept no for an answer, that there just is no link between the MMR vaccine and autism. Yeah, and those studies were brought up by Dr. Cassidy, Senator Cassidy, in the hearing, and Mr. Kennedy would not affirm them. Senator Cassidy still voted for him, though. But I want to ask you about another issue. Our correspondent, Camilo Montoya Galvez, has learned the Trump administration is preparing plans to use a health authority known as Title 42, which you remember was used during the pandemic,
to restrict migrant agents' entries across the southern border. Now they want to invoke it on the basis of other diseases like TB. Is that warranted right now? Is TB that much of a problem?
Well, look, I think from a policy standpoint, the administration has done a good job shutting down flows across the border. So I'm not sure why they're reaching for a public health measure to try to provide an additional provision, additional tool. They seem to have done a good job with the law enforcement that they're doing at the border. Just from the objective standpoint of TB and the risk of TB being transported across the border, TB incidence rates are high in the countries where immigrants are coming from, but they're not exceedingly high relative to other countries. So you look at a country like Mexico, the incidence of TB is about 30 cases per 100,000 people. In Venezuela, where there's also immigrants coming from, it's about 45 per 100,000. That compares to about 10 per 100,000 in a country like England. But you look at a country like India, the incidence is about 200 per 100,000. In South Africa, it's about 500 per 100,000. So there's a lot of countries around the world where people come in from all the time, where the incidence of TB is much higher than what it is in the countries where people are coming across the border from. Now, you can argue that people coming in the country from South Africa or India are going through regular checkpoints where they might undergo some screening. But I think just purely from an objective public health standpoint, there's probably parts of the world where we have immigrants coming in that provide a larger risk of the transmission of TB than across the border.
Can you give us some perspective on the thousands of employees who are being dismissed from federal health agencies? Should the public be concerned?
Look, I don't think they should be concerned. I think that there have been steps taken to try to re-adjudicate some of those initial dismissals, at least within the public health context. When you look across HHS, and I'm most familiar with FDA, where they're hiring back a number of employees, and I think they could hire back fully half of the employees that were initially dismissed at the FDA, and they've tried to preserve things like review functions and inspectors at FDA. They didn't do it perfectly because of the way they went about this. They riffed the probationary employees, so they did catch some employees I think are in critical functions. They seem to be hiring them back. You know, just objectively, they look at this and they say, well, the number of people hired has gone up a lot in recent years, and they want to reduce headcount. And so I think they need to be more judicious about who they target.
Dr. Gottlieb, I'm sorry, I got to leave it right there. We'll be right back. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.